Hi everybody. We are in chapter 17. And the title of the chapter 17 is Broga. And Broga is the second to last character that is going to appear in the Three Feathers. We think he's very small, but he's really, really big. And he's a great, great character. And today it happened that I went into this little store and I found one that had the proportions that I thought of in the story. Broga is really, really minuscule. He's a little peeper frog. But as you will see in this chapter, he has great power and he plays a key role in the adventure of Joshua, Gray, and Creek when they try to go into the mountain to save Wind. So here we are. Back to me. I know it's more boring than the frog. Anyway, so we are at chapter 17. I'm hoping I will get Broga's voice right, because what you don't realize when you start reading a book out loud into the camera is I think there are 7 different voices, and the first 2 are easy, the third one, and then the fourth and the fifth one. You have to think about, how you pronounce them, and anyway, I hope you can distinguish the voices. 17, Broga. When Joshua saw it, he stopped and turned around. It was at first only a dot in the landscape, but it came closer fast. "What is this?" Gray asked, and stopped as well. They had made good progress, and were about 3/4 of the way between the Lake of Tears and the pond below the Great Wall. Gray had discovered a narrow path that did not follow the river, but cut a relatively straight line toward the pond. They had stopped only once, and only for Gray to catch a few muskrats by the river, and for Joshua to find some berries. They had been starving. Joshua thought that if they could maintain their current speed, they would have about half a day of walking left until they reached the water. From there, it was just a matter of figuring out how to find the entrance. He didn't have any illusions about how hard it would be. It was put in place by the Sky People, who didn't want anyone to gain access to the mountain. Another thought that kept coming back to him was that the entrance may have simply collapsed over time, and because of it, there was no way into the mountain at all anymore. "It's Creek." Gray saw him first. The warhorse ran in full gallop toward them, pulling a dust cloud behind him. Before he caught up to them, they could hear his panic-stricken thoughts. Wind, taken, spiders were the only fragments Joshua could decipher, so erratic were the horse's thoughts. "They took her." Creek's thoughts poured out of him when he arrived, and his emotions hit Joshua and Gray like a battering ram. "They took her into the mountain. I came too late. They captured her." "Who captured her?" the wolf asked. "Spiders and a griffin vulture," Creek answered. "Spiders?" Joshua was surprised. "I thought they were harmless." "They were," Creek answered. "They were harmless until the vulture resurrected the dead ones. She said she will wait inside the mountain for us. She wants to exchange Wind for you, Joshua." They looked at each other. Creek's right wing was lifted up, showing the deep, blood-filled and infested markings the vulture had left. Joshua could sense Creek's pain. "You fought her?" Gray asked. "Yes," Creek answered. "I had no chance against her in the air. Elda mentioned something about a dark counterpart to the Dreamer of Light. I think she meant you, Joshua." "Me?" Joshua was surprised. "I don't understand." "The eagle has told me about her," Gray thought. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" Joshua asked. "I didn't want to upset you," the wolf answered. "Also, I thought it a myth, not a reality." "A myth? What kind of myth?" "The eagle spoke about a dark counterpart to the Dreamer of Light, who was awakened the same time as the Dreamer." A counterpart? Joshua had trouble grasping the idea and its full implications. Yes, the dreamer who sets out to find the three feathers inevitably awakens the dark counterpart of himself. If you are on one tipping point of the pendulum, Joshua, the griffin vulture is on the other side. She's the darkness to your light. She is your opposite. Joshua thought about this. Why hadn't he heard this before? There were other legends he had known of or heard of in the past, not this one. Creek, I'm so sorry about Wind. We have to get her back, Creek answered. I cannot bear to think about her being captured like this when she had just escaped her prison a few days past. The time of freedom that was given her was too short, far too short. We have to find her and free her. We will, Creek, I promise you. Joshua was surprised at the strength this thought evoked in him. He felt fear, yes, but he also felt something else deep inside him that stirred, that moved, small still, but there nevertheless. It was the image of the lioness that brought forth this response in him. We will find her, Creek, and when we do, we will save her. Then let us go and find the entrance to the mountain, and let us be swift, the wolf answered. Creek, can you fly? Joshua thought. I don't think so. The claws of the vulture must have severed a muscle or at least injured it in such a way that I can't use this wing for long. But I can run, Joshua. Come on my back. Before Creek could finish the thought, Joshua had already jumped up and the horse began to trot. Gray ran in front of them and both found a speed that they could sustain for a while. Joshua could almost physically feel Creek's pain. The cuts were deep and infested, and each step caused his wing to brush against them. But the pain in the horse's body was nothing compared to the pain he felt for Wind in his heart. Joshua knew that the mighty warhorse had at last found an enemy that he did not wish to meet in battle. The notion that he had lost Wind and that she would not survive. They ran the remainder of the distance without stopping for water or rest. Joshua still had no idea how to get inside the mountain, and another question rose inside him. It was the question as to how the vulture would get Wind into the mountain. If the entrance was sealed, and if the Porte de Leones was the only way in, but maybe there was another entrance, and one they could find also. Joshua kept looking ahead toward the pond that was now clearly visible in the distance. There was nothing but the sheer cliff of the great wall above it, with no sign of an entrance whatsoever. Until he saw it. Just like up in the tower room when he saw the head of the lioness jump out at him, it suddenly became visible. And because the path they took led straight toward it, it was hidden to them up until now. Joshua realized that they did not go toward the head of the lioness. They were about to go into its mouth. They were walking toward its massive outcropping of rock that jutted straight out of the wall and was shaped like the head of the lioness. Joshua could see the outline of her head and ears, and from where they stood, it looked as if the path led straight into the open mouth. This was not a man-made sculpture, but the shape of the rock was unmistakably recognizable as the head of a lioness. Creek and Gray slowed down, as they now stood almost directly below the upper part of the mouth. Joshua estimated that it was at least 8 stories above him, and from here it was nothing more than a large overhang in the cliff. In front of them, in the shadows, lay the pond. It was covered in lily pads. The blue color they had seen from the distance was not water, but the surface of the lily pads leaves, which emitted a dark blue hue. As they entered the mouth of the lioness, Joshua realized immediately that there was no visible entrance into the mountain itself. Where the pond ended was a slight mound going uphill until it met the rock in the back of the mouth. The rock itself was smooth like the rest of the wall. There was no indication of an entrance whatsoever. Joshua flew off Creek's back as they walked around the pond. The sound of a single peeper frog was the only thing they heard. They looked closely at the surface of the rock, but there was absolutely nothing there. Joshua couldn't even begin to think of where to start looking. It would take days, weeks even. Maybe we have to go back and into the spider holes. The wolf's thoughts cut through the silence. That might be the only entrance, deep underground. If this is what it takes, what are we waiting for? Creek's thoughts were filled with impatience. No, Creek, there must be a way. We came this far. I do not believe that we should go back to the holes of the spiders. Joshua tried to sound convinced, much more than he was in truth. The entrance must be here somewhere. We just have to find it. Joshua began to walk along the wall, looking for any sign of a door, an opening, something out of the ordinary. Gray sniffed the ground around the pond. Creek seemed to have lost all hope of ever finding it. He stood, his head low, waves of misery radiating from him. If we do not find it, he thought to them, all of this was for naught. Everything we did up until now will have amounted to nothing. And I wish I would have died at the hands of my captors before you found me, for that is how I feel in my heart. Joshua looked at his friend and felt his heart break for him. Gray walked over and lay down next to Creek. Joshua did the same. There was nothing to say. All three of them felt the other's pain, felt the sudden end of their journey come nearer with every breath they took. Joshua dreaded the possibility that they would have to go through the spider holes, but maybe it was the only way into the mountain. He let the thought stand in his mind for a moment to see if it would gain strength. There is a way in. Neither of the three reacted at first. They were too immersed in their despair. And I know it. What was that? Gray thought to them. I heard it too, Joshua replied. I thought it was you, Joshua, Creek thought. It wasn't me, Joshua answered. If it wasn't you, who was it? Gray got up. It was me. The three of them looked around. The thought was quiet, not so much a whisper, but rather from someone who was very far away. Can you hear me? Neither of them could see anything. Where's this coming from? Joshua thought. Hello? Would you please tell the mighty warhorse not to move his front hooves? I'm right next to them, and I do not wish to be trampled. Joshua walked over to Creek and looked around his hooves. Creek's head was down, and he was sniffing the grass. Here you are. It was Gray who found him first. It was the peeper frog. He sat next to one of the horse's front hoofs. He was so small, the three of them had to come very close to see him. You must be either very young or you're just very small, Joshua thought to him. I am neither, the peeper replied, looking up at them. I am neither young nor small, for I am Broga, the guardian of the Porte de Leones. How old are you, Broga? The wolf asked, if I may ask. If you must know, and I know you must, Gray, wolf from the ice forest, I was present when Elda was born. The three of them looked at each other in disbelief. She was born right here in this pond, under the protection of the lioness. I saw her fight her way through the thick shell of the egg she grew in. In fact, I heard her singing before she came out of it. She sang then, and she has never since stopped singing. Joshua felt hope returning into Creek's heart and into his own. He had no explanation for this. Nevertheless, this tiny little peeper had within moments given them back all the hope they had lost. Why should I not give you hope, my feathered friend? The tiny frog looked up at them. Have not you given hope to some much larger than yourself? Hope does not judge your size, and neither should you. Never doubt that anyone with a fierce belief in his own destiny can't reach for the stars, as far away as they might seem to be. Gray was the first to break the silence induced by Broga's thoughts. The vulture has captured the Pegasus, and the spiders she has resurrected have brought her deep into the mines below Storm Mountain. She demanded from us the exchange of the Pegasus for Joshua. We cannot agree to this, but we will and we must find Wind and free her, and with her complete our journey to find the 3 feathers. For my friend has set out to find them, and we have agreed to help him in his quest. All was quiet. All eyes were on Broga, the little frog, who looked from one to the other. Since the mines were sealed by the Sky People, no one has entered them, and it has been my task to guard the entrance since then. How can the vulture get access to the mountain if she cannot come through here? Creek asked. The entrance was sealed so that no one was able to ever enter the mines again. Broga's thoughts were quiet, as if what he had to say was too important to be thought louder. This gate, the Porte de Leonesse, was for the living, but in order to seal the entrance for the living, another entrance had to be opened, and that one is only for the dead. It took a few moments for them to grasp what this meant, what this would mean. Are you saying that in order for Wind to be brought into the mountain, she has to be dead? Creek's calm thought betrayed the sense of despair that welled up inside him. Yes, the finality hit Joshua in full force. We should try to get to her before the vulture takes her through the gate, Creek thought. I do not think this wise, Broga answered, for you will never reach them in time, and if they are through the gate already, then you cannot pass through it yourself. You would have to come back here, and then would have lost too much time. Broga, can you show us the way into the mountain? Joshua asked. The people looked at them. I have been guarding this gate for over 1,000 years. It has since never been opened. Has anyone ever asked you to open it? Joshua asked. There was a pause. Broga, has anyone ever asked you to open the gate before? No, no one has ever asked me. Many have come here in their search for the entrance, but left a few days later. Because they didn't know it was right here. They didn't know the entrance was only visible from the refuge, and only if you were to stand right between the eyes of the lioness, looking through the westerly window and beyond the small crack in the glass. No one knew where the Porte de Leonesse was. The ones before us were only guessing, am I right? Broga, am I right? Yes. Then tell us how to get into the mountain. Joshua was surprised over the strength of his outburst. We cannot wait any longer. You must show us the entrance. Too much is at stake, and we are worthy. Are we not? We are worthy. With that last sentence, Joshua seemed to collapse into himself, as if once he had thought the words, he no longer could believe them. You are worthy, Joshua. We are worthy, Gray thought to them. We are worthy, Creek thought quietly. There was silence. The thoughts echoed for a while in each of them. They had never spoken them like this before, never dared to. There was still a part within them that did not believe this to be true, but they did not have a choice. They needed to believe they were worthy. Joshua looked at his companions and saw the same determination in them than he felt in himself. I will show you the entrance, Joshua from the great lake, Broga thought to them, and I will open it for you. But you must know that once you are inside the mountain, there is no way back for you. You must face whatever awaits you inside. You cannot go back, for I will neither be able to hear you, nor will I be able to open the gate more than once. You must realize this, and fully. If you do, I will open the gate for you right now. Do it, Gray thought. Open it now, Creek replied. I want you to open it, Broga, guardian of the gate. In the name of the lioness, I want you to open the door into the mountain, Joshua answered. There was a pause that in Joshua's mind seemed to stretch into infinity. Too much hung in the balance for them to fail now. The stakes were too high for them not to succeed. So be it. The frog's thoughts reached them quietly. With that, Broga hopped in between Creek and Gray and up the incline toward the wall. Joshua and the others followed slowly. When the peeper reached the wall, he went along it, feeling with his hands for something in the stone. Then he stopped. It was hard to see exactly, but it seemed that he pushed against the wall and a tiny piece of the rock moved inward. It looked like a door that was barely high enough to let the peeper stand up in. It was minuscule. Broga entered. What occurred next was so astounding as it was unbelievable. It looked as if the tiny peeper pushed against the rock. Nothing seemed to happen at first. Then suddenly a straight vertical crack appeared above the peeper that went up at least 10 feet. Broga pushed, and now the entrance moved. It was a massive slab of rock, solid rock. The little peeper pushed it, and it seemed to slide to the side, leaving an opening. Joshua was the first to enter. He realized that the gate was as thick as it was wide, solid granite. The tiny peeper moved the boulder, and even though Joshua could see the strain in Broga's features, he could not believe that he was actually able to push it. Gray entered next, followed by Krieg. When the three of them were inside, they watched as Broga slowly pulled the gate closed. There were no goodbyes. When the door shut, and it once again became invisible, as if it had never existed in the first place, Broga sat down outside, under the head of the lioness, at the edge where the earth met the stone, and thought about his life and what he had accomplished. He had opened the gate to the one who was destined to enter the mountain. He had fulfilled his life's purpose. He closed his eyes and became very peaceful. After a few minutes, he drifted off and fell into a deep sleep from which he never woke up. Hi everybody, we are chapter 18, Submerged. Chapter 18, Submerged, is one of the shortest chapters in the book, and part of me is glad that it's so short because it was very hard to write because of its subject matter, which is submerged. It was not a happy chapter by any means, and it was a very tough thing to write. There was no sound when the door closed. Joshua expected it to be pitch black, but instead there was a slight glow that emanated from the surface of the tube-like tunnel they stood in. It was just high enough for Krieg to walk upright. Its surface was smooth and solid, similar to the outside of the mountain. Joshua followed the tunnel with his eyes, but could not see the end of it. It disappeared far into the distance. "Are you ready?" Gray asked. "No," Joshua answered truthfully, and began to walk into the tunnel. There seemed to be a slight downward pitch to it. The sound of their steps on the ground echoed through the semi-darkness as they made their way ever deeper into the mountain. If the others had any thoughts, they kept them to themselves. Krieg was limping slightly. The deep oozing cuts from the vulture had gotten more infected, and Joshua was afraid the infection would spread the longer they walked. The low glowing that came from the surface of the stone around them illuminated the wounds and made them appear almost black. Krieg also couldn't lift his head, as the height of the tunnel didn't allow it. Gray seemed fine. Nose to the ground, he concentrated on picking out any smells he could detect. Joshua had lost all sense of time. He couldn't tell if they had been walking for hours or just minutes. His talons began to hurt. The smooth granite was hard and unforgiving. He began to feel thirsty. He hoped they would get through this tunnel soon, even though he had no idea what to expect on the other side. "There's water ahead," the wolf proclaimed. and only a short while later they came to a large puddle. Joshua gratefully drank from it. The horse and Gray did the same. While he drank, Joshua looked down the long tunnel. He realized something that almost made his heart stop. "Gray, how far can you see down into the tunnel?" he asked quietly. Gray looked ahead, so did Creek. The three of them saw it at the same time. The surface of the water mirrored the slightly glowing ceiling. The further they looked into the tunnel, the closer the surface seemed to come to the ceiling. Far in the distance, the surface of the water and the ceiling met. From then on, the tunnel was submerged. Joshua's heart sank. He looked at his companions. But before he could form a clear thought and communicate it with the others, Creek began to walk into the water. "Jump on my back," read one. "There's no use standing here. Forward is the only way to go." Joshua flew on the horse's back. He had to drop his head and crouch down so he wouldn't scrape along the ceiling. Gray began to swim next to them. Joshua watched him. Was this where their journey together would end? In a tunnel somewhere deep inside a mountain? Fear crept up inside him, tightening its grip around his chest. He had almost drowned twice. It was probably the worst experience of his life, and he did not look forward to experiencing it again. As they drew closer to the point where the water met the ceiling, he tried to push away the overwhelming feeling of sickness that welled up in him. He had trouble breathing. "Joshua." Gray had a tendency to interrupt his thoughts at exactly the right time. "I will go first and see what's down there and come back. Creek will not be able to turn around in there." Before Joshua could give any thought to this, Gray disappeared into the blackness. The horse's head stuck out of the water just enough for him to breathe. They waited and waited. After what must have been an eternity, Joshua couldn't take it any longer. "I will be right back," he thought to the horse, and with that he jumped. Once underwater, he began to use his talons to push forward, but remembered very quickly that they were useless down here. The water was pitch black. The light on the tunnel's surface was completely swallowed up by the water. He felt a moment of panic, but then he became very still. It was as if his mind stopped its activity. He forgot about the question of what would happen if he didn't find an air pocket somewhere. He stopped thinking about Gray, and he stopped thinking about his own life. And suddenly it was clear to him. It was clear that he could do only one thing now. He opened his wings and pushed them downward and back, moving his body forward. After a couple of strokes, Gray appeared in front of him. His thoughts were panic-stricken. "Follow me," Joshua told him. He turned and swam back to where he came from. He felt the wolf behind him, but the connection to him was fading fast. "We're almost there, Gray. Hold on," he thought as he came up from the water. The wolf barely made it, and when Creek realized that Gray was in trouble, he put his head under the wolf's belly and pushed him upward. The wolf hung there, miserably trying to get air into his lungs, but he was alive, and that was all that counted at the moment. Joshua realized that he was able to somehow keep his head above water, at least for now. "I'm going back," Joshua thought. "No, Joshua. Let me rest a while and I'll go back," Gray replied, still gagging from the water in his lungs. "You can't go, Joshua. It's too dangerous," Creek added. "There's no other way. I will try to reach you. Keep your mind open." Joshua went under. He figured he would do 5 strokes with his wings and see where this got him. If he didn't see anything, he would turn back. He looked for some light, or at least a glow indicating that part of the surface of the tunnel walls were not underwater. When he was at the 6th stroke of his wings, he decided to turn around. He thought he did, but it was so dark that he didn't see at all where he was going, and suddenly he slammed into the tunnel wall. Panic rose in him. He was uncertain which way to go. He decided to go left, thinking that this was the way back to the others. 4 more strokes, but he still couldn't see anything. 2 more, and he felt his lungs were about to burst. The blackness around him was complete, and he tried desperately not to panic. But it was too late. A wave of dizziness enveloped him. His last wing stroke was already very weak. The impulse to take a breath was overwhelming. Before he passed out, he saw a glimpse of a low glow in front of him. He came back to life, lying on the horse's head. He couldn't breathe at first, but then he realized that he wasn't underwater anymore, and that he could take a deep breath and fill his lungs with air. At the same time, it occurred to him that they weren't back where they had started from. His head was close to the ceiling. Gray was treading water next to him. They were inside an air pocket that barely fit the three of them. There was a small space between the water's surface and the tunnel ceiling. "How did you get here?" Joshua asked. "We couldn't let you go by yourself," Gray answered. "We certainly couldn't," Creek added. "Try to hold on to my back. If I let the air out of my lungs, I can walk underwater. We must be about halfway between where we started and the other side." "I hope so." Joshua was not convinced. He felt numb and weak. He just wanted to rest and escape the feeling that they were buried inside a tunnel deep inside a mountain. They waited a few more minutes to catch their breath. There was no turning back from here. They would either make it onto the other side together, or they wouldn't. It was as simple and as terrifying as that. When Creek led Joshua gently into the water, he felt the cold seep into his body. Then the horse's head disappeared and Joshua went under. The wolf was first. Joshua held on to the horse's back as much as possible, thankful to have Creek there with him. He knew they only had a very limited window of time and only one shot at this. There was a certain rhythm to the horse's movement that was very reassuring, at least for a while, until Joshua realized that the horse was in trouble. It felt like a convulsion in Creek's back. The strain of walking underwater and the fact that he had to let out half of the air in his lungs weakened him rapidly. "Can't hold breath much longer," was what Joshua heard. A second convulsion went through Creek's back. Joshua couldn't distinguish anymore between his own and the horse's dizziness, and the attempt to squeeze every ounce of air they had out of their lungs got weaker and weaker every second. "Light!" Gray shouted in his thoughts, and then they saw that the surface of the water mirrored the glowing walls of the tunnel ahead. Part of Joshua's mind registered that Creek's movement had slowed down. He was about to lose consciousness. If that happened, the horse most certainly drowned. "Creek, we're almost there. You can make it." With that, Joshua dug his talons into the horse's back and with his last ounce of strength pushed his wings backwards. Once, twice. They moved slowly toward the light. One more time and the horse's head came out of the water. Joshua let go and came up as well. They swam as quickly as they could to the water's edge, and when Joshua reached it, he looked back and saw that Creek had collapsed. Only his head was out of the water, resting on the stone. The wolf stood there shivering miserably. "Are you okay, Creek?" Joshua thought. For a while there was no answer, other than the massive chest of the horse moving up and down as he labored for breath. "Creek, are you going to be all right?" Joshua was too weak to move. "I will be okay," Creek's thought reached Joshua faintly. "I will be okay." Joshua's last thought, before he fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, was of Elda, and how she possibly could have known that a rooster needed so desperately to learn how to swim underwater. So a funny thing just happened. When I said chapter 18, Submerged, is short, it's kind of short, but there's actually something else that comes beyond this part that I just read, and I totally missed that, of course. So anyway, I'm just gonna keep reading. We're still in chapter 18, Submerged, and the last sentence that you heard was Joshua's last thought before he fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, was of Elda and of how she possibly could have known that a rooster needed so desperately to learn how to swim underwater. For a long time there was darkness. Wind could feel the bodies of the spiders under her when they carried her deep underground, through tunnels that have never seen the sun, through ancient passageways that never ended. The sound of hundreds of feet crawling over the ground, dampened only by the web that was tightly wrapped around her head, was the only thing she heard. She could hear the spiders' feet far ahead and far behind her as they brought her deeper and deeper toward their lair. They did not stop, they did not rest. As if led by an invisible command that left them no choice but to respond, they carried their precious cargo until they reached their destination. The cave was not very high, but expansive in length and width. Its floor and ceiling had sharp, spear-like crystals sticking out of them. Most of the crystals were covered in spider webs. There was a light source somewhere whose origin Wind could not determine. It illuminated the bizarrely shaped growths and cast long shadows on one side of them. The stench that lay in the air was of acid and decay and the unthinkable. The massive vulture sat on one of the jagged pillars, her head cocked to one side. Below her sat two of the hyenas. One had half of her fur missing. It was scraped off, exposing the raw skin and flesh down to several partially decomposed ribs. Her dead eyes were bloodshot. Small veins stood in the sclera, and what had once been white had taken on a yellowish tone. The other had flesh and skin hanging from their jawbone, and worms crawling in and out of what was left of her ear. Her teeth were bared, revealing black gums. As fast as the spiders had wrapped Wind in their first encounter on the surface, they now loosened their ties with hundreds of pincers, tearing through the silken thread until all of it was gone, except one thick piece tied around each wing and secured to one of the crystalline growths. When she stood up, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her legs weak, she had trouble standing. Spiders covered the ground and ceiling as far as she could see. At least a dozen of them sat right above her, their eyes peering at her, waiting for the smallest command from their master. "We meet at last." The vulture's thoughts brought with it the full impact of her malice. Wind could not escape the darkness, hopelessness, and despair they induced in her. She felt utterly alone. "Yes," the vulture exclaimed triumphantly, "alone is what you are, and far from home. So far that never again will you reach its comfort, never again stand on familiar ground, never again touch kinship or brotherhood. It will forever be outside your reach. And death will only claim you once you have realized that even then peace will never find you. You will always be searching it, even in the afterlife." The vulture jumped from her perch and landed in front of her. She was a head taller than Wind, even on equal ground. "I will lay the marks of death upon your soul, and it will burn. The poison will sink deep into it, and there it will fester and make it its home." The vulture's head was now close to Wind's. Her one dead eye looked into hers, and suddenly the vulture let out a loud cry. At the same time, she screamed at Wind in her thoughts. Wind moved backwards, trying to avoid her gaze. For an instant, Wind thought she saw the slightest hint of fear in the vulture. "Let me ease your passing through the gate," the vulture screamed. With that, she jumped onto the back of the Pegasus and dug her talons deep into her skin. Wind's screams echoed through the subterranean lair. They never reached further than that. Joshua thought that he must have slept for quite some time, for when he opened his eyes, his feathers were almost dry. Creek stood a few feet away, looking down at him. Gray sat on the other side. "How long did I sleep?" Joshua shook himself. Besides a chill that still lingered, he felt surprisingly good. "For a while," Gray replied. "We all did. And now we should get out of here." "Well said," Creek added. They began to walk. away from the water and up the slight incline of the tunnel. Joshua saw that Creek's cuts from the vulture looked much better. The infection seemed to have gone completely, and the wounds were beginning to heal. "You're healing well," he told the horse. "Yes, I feel much better. The pain in my side is gone almost completely," Creek replied. "There must be something in the water that counteracts the vulture's poison," the wolf remarked. Gray's thought steered the somber memory of their captured friend in them. They all, in one way or another, tried to keep the thought of Wind's fate away from their hearts. The place where it would lead them was too dark, the sorrow over what would become of her too deep. But as much as they tried, they could not escape the gruesome images their imagination bestowed on them. Joshua could only hope that the images were wrong and just a cruel trick his mind played on him. Creek, who had experienced the vulture's razor-sharp talons firsthand, took it especially hard. They walked in silence for a long time, until the light slowly began to increase. Its source came from the end of the tunnel. It still lay in the distance, but was now visible as a small opening that grew larger the closer they came. When they reached it and stepped through it onto a plateau that was covered in thick green moss, they could not believe their eyes. The platform they stood on was suspended high above a deep chasm. Far below and to their right, a waterfall disappeared into the darkness. The falls were illuminated by a beam of light from high above. On the other side of the crevice, across from where they stood, was another platform similar to this one. Beyond it was an opening leading further into the mountain. Both platforms had a narrow tongue of stone reaching toward the other. The middle part was missing. There was a gap easily 50 yards wide. The three friends stood at the edge, looking across, dizzied by the sheer drop. They could not see the bottom of the abyss. Joshua thought that he would very possibly be able to make it to the other side. He had gained some strength in his wings since he had left the pen. Creek should be able to make it also. But there was no way the wolf could. "Why don't you two go? I'll stay," Gray thought to them. "We can't leave you here," Creek replied. "You can't stay here with me either. That would do nobody any good. You have to go and find Wind, Creek. And you have to fight the vulture and get her back. I will be happy to stay here, knowing that you will find her and free her." The wolf's thoughts hung there like a sword, Joshua felt. He could not imagine going on without Gray by his side. "Do not be concerned with me, Red One, for you have yet to find your full strength and go far beyond yourself. You will not be able to do this if you stay here." "I do not wish to find strength within me if this means not to walk with you on my side." "I will walk with you, Joshua. There will never be a day in which I will not walk with you. But now you must go." Joshua heard the wolf's thoughts, but their meaning did not sink in. They stayed on the surface without much impact on him. He could not fathom losing his companion, and he would rather stay here and starve to death before he would leave him. "Joshua, if you stay here, then all is lost. Wind will have died in vain. We all will have died in vain. You must go, I beg of you." Gray's thoughts were unyielding. Joshua looked at him. Then he slowly retreated from the edge and went backwards toward the tunnel. "Don't be so stubborn. You cannot hold off the inevitable." The wolf's thoughts were loud and powerful in his mind, accompanied by a low snarl. Joshua realized that he meant what he thought completely. "I cannot, Gray. If this is the end of the journey for you, it is the end for me as well." "Then you are responsible if Creek does not find Wind. Do you want this? Do you want to prevent him from seeing his beloved again?" "No, I do not wish to see him suffer. But neither do I wish to see you die alone with no one but yourself to comfort you." "We all go, or none of us does." Creek's thoughts reached them both, abruptly ending their quarrel. "You make no sense, Warhorse," the wolf replied angrily. "And you must learn that you will never again be left behind. Creek answered. There was a moment of silence, during which they looked at each other, seeing in one another what they could have never dreamed of before they began this journey. They knew at that moment that whatever happened, their friendship would abide. "Here is what we will do." There was a warrior in Creek that he thought had been lost in endless battles with no purpose. He fought his way to the surface, for now he found something he could fight for and believe in. And when this purpose rose inside him, the warrior stood up and took control. "Gray, jump on my back. I will carry you to the other side. Joshua, you will follow us once we have landed safely there." Without waiting for an answer, he went to the edge and unfolded his wings, testing their strength with several powerful strokes. "Come now, Wolf, and do not think twice on it." Joshua looked at Gray, who met his eyes. He nodded slightly. The wolf turned and trotted back 10 yards. He stood there for a moment and then charged forward toward the horse. When he jumped, Creek pushed his massive wings down, and when the wolf landed on Creek's back, he lifted off. For a moment they hovered there. Then they dropped like a stone. Joshua saw them disappear below the edge. He ran toward it, and when he got there and looked over the rim, they were far down already, dwarfed against the blackness of the abyss. He saw Creek's wings move, working against the fall, the sound of it echoing eerily through the cave. Fear gripped Joshua's throat. He thought about plunging after them, but he heard Creek's faint thoughts that told him unmistakably to stay where he was. Joshua felt absolutely powerless, unable to watch them and unable to look away. How long is an instant? How long can it stretch out? For Joshua, this one felt like an eternity, until slowly, too slowly, the horse gained height. "You can do it, Creek," he thought to himself over and over. "Don't give up, please." Joshua tried, as if by the sheer power of his mind, to lift his friends up and carry them to safety. There was an instant just before they made it to the other side when Joshua saw in the horse's eyes that he fought for his life and the life of the wolf, only a few feet below the edge. His strength had left him, but he still pushed on, trying desperately to gain the last short distance to safety. And then Joshua saw the wolf jump off and land on the other side. Creek followed, collapsing right where he landed. "Come to us," Joshua heard Creek's thoughts. Gray looked at him across the gap. Joshua could see the terror still looming in his face. He peered down into the abyss. The light wasn't able to penetrate the darkness far below. Joshua's heart pounded against his chest. Creek lifted up his head. "Do it now, Joshua." Joshua knew that if he were to think about this, he would lose all hope of ever doing it. So he locked eyes with Gray and pushed off, his wings unfolding. He tried not to look down, but it was as if a magnetic force pulled his glance downward. "Stay with me," Gray demanded, and Joshua did. The wolf's eyes became his guide, and he flew across the large gap and landed safely on the other side. Hi everybody, we are at chapter 19, Ambushed. They rested for a short while, with Joshua sitting close to Creek, who lay on the mossy ground until he gained some of his strength back. At length they got up wordlessly and walked into the round opening of the second tunnel. None of them looked back. The tunnel went a relatively short distance into the mountain, and after a steep incline ended in another round opening that spilled them out onto grass. It didn't register right away as they stepped onto it. What they saw now was so strange it was hard to accept at first. Before them a valley extended as far as they could see. There were soft rolling hills, green and lush. A distance away they saw what looked like a settlement of small houses, tucked into the landscape. Dotted throughout the valley stood massive pillars of rough-cut stone, reaching far up and toward a ceiling that was so high above them it was hard to make out at all. The stone pillars were easily 200 yards in diameter. The same light source that they had seen in the other cave, or at least Joshua surmised that it was the same, illuminated parts of the landscape like a sun that stood low on the horizon. There were areas that lay deep in the shadows and others that were flooded with light. A slight mist hung in the air, giving the image in front of them an otherworldly quality. The small path in the grass led away from them and far down into the valley. It meandered through the hills, reflecting the light like a thread of silver, and ending in what must have been an ancient mining town during the time when the mountain was still harvested for rare crystallite. That was more than 1,000 years ago. They walked away from the pillar and onto the path. When Joshua turned around, he saw that the landscape behind them extended an almost equal distance, as it did in the front. He realized that the exit from the second tunnel was through one of the massive pillars. Joshua, Creek, and the wolf were awestruck by the magnificent scope of the land before them. It felt as if a force of great power had created this. A cataclysmic event of enormous magnitude occurred here in ancient times, millennia before the mining operations began. Joshua suddenly felt very small in relation to the landscape around him. He could sense that there was something larger at work here, and he saw himself as just a tiny cog in a huge machinery that turned irrevocably, pushing him in a direction he was no longer sure he wanted to go. The further they moved away from the pillar, the larger it seemed. It became clear to them that the distance to the ruins of the mining town was much further than they thought at first. But having survived the last few hours had lifted their spirits, and they made good time as they traveled down the path and through the hills below. "This is odd," Gray remarked when they were about halfway down the path between the tunnel and the town. "What is it?" Joshua asked. He sat on Creek's back. They had decided that it would be easier if Joshua traveled the longer distances on the horse's back rather than trying to walk and keep up with the speed of the other two. "The source of light is constant," the wolf answered. "Since we came here, it has not moved. I am just wondering how long it will stay this way." Joshua agreed with Gray. He too had had the brief and fearful thought that it would at some point just go dark. But he pushed the thought away. No sense of playing the game of what if. Living through the ordeals of their journey had helped steel him against the thoughts like this. At least he was able to keep them at bay for most part. That in itself was new to him. When the mining town came closer, they saw that some of the houses were still intact. The path they were on had become a road that eventually would lead into the town center. From it, smaller roads branched off in both directions. The cluster of buildings extended into the hills that surrounded the town. There was a small stream that ran parallel to where they walked. It disappeared underground a little further down the road, only to appear again close to the center of the town. "It is so quiet here," Creek remarked. "It seems there's no one in here other than ourselves." "No one that lives, anyway," Gray answered. He immediately realized the meaning of what he had said. "I'm sorry, Creek. I didn't want to burden you with more thoughts of wind. Do not concern yourself with it, Gray. I have a sense that she may still be alive after all," Creek answered. Joshua and the wolf exchanged a brief glance. They saw it in each other's eyes that Creek was the only one who believed the Pegasus was still among the living. Quietly, they walked the rest of the way until they passed the first house. Most of them had no roofs. Blind windows peered at them. The stone with which they were built was crumbling and overgrown with vines. Some of them had thick layers of moss growing in them. When they stopped for a moment to rest by the small creek, they realized that aside from the slow-running water of the stream, there was absolutely no sound whatsoever. It was eerily quiet. When they continued toward the center and the creek disappeared underground, the sound of Creek's hooves on the road echoed through the abandoned streets like a reminder that as vast as this cave was, they were alone. Until Joshua became aware of them. Out of his peripheral vision, he saw a shadow move between two buildings. It was low to the ground and fast and gone when he looked again. Then there was another further down the road. Joshua looked at the wolf. I saw it. Gray's thought was quiet. What do you think? Joshua answered as quietly. How the hyenas made it into the mountain? I do not know, the wolf answered. But they are here now. I counted 4 of them so far, 2 on either side of us. Joshua, you stay with Creek. I will take care of them. Joshua was about to tell him that this certainly was not a good idea when Creek's thoughts reached them. His were as quiet as their own. I do not doubt you could take them, Wolf, if they were among the living. But they are not. They are dead and not bound by the laws you and I believe in. You cannot take them, but be assured that they can take you. Gray looked at him. What do you suggest? We have to stay together, Creek answered. That is our only chance to get out of this alive and in one piece. There was no time for either of them to form another thought. The hyenas came at them from 2 directions. One came from between 2 houses and charged toward them. Gray, out of sheer instinct, charged toward her. At the same time, another jumped out of a window that was near where Creek stood. It took the horse completely by surprise. The hyena reached him before he could move. Her huge fangs open, she flew at him. Her teeth scraped his side before he went on his hind legs. That was probably what saved him. She couldn't grab onto his skin and let go for only an instant. It was enough for him to kick her with his front legs, and she winced, retreated back a few feet. The wolf wasn't as lucky. The hyena attacked him with all that she had, and even though he was at least equal in strength and speed, he was no match for her ferocity. Joshua realized that Gray wouldn't last very long. He flew off the horse's back and toward the wolf. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, except to do something to disturb the hyena's relentless attacks. So he landed on her back. It was not a place he wanted to end up, but he didn't have full control over his flying and landing skills. He dug his talons into the hyena's back and started pecking at her. He wasn't sure if she even felt it, but she turned her head once to see what was happening behind her. That was enough for the wolf to charge forward and grab the hyena by her throat. Under normal circumstances, this would have killed her instantly. But even after his teeth had penetrated the skin and flesh, she showed no signs of slowing down. Her attacks just got more ferocious. I don't know how to kill her. The wolf's panicked thoughts came fast. Any ideas? In his periphery, Joshua saw the horse trample the hyena, kicking it several times, but she just got back up and came charging at him again. This was a losing battle. The hyenas did not get tired, and as of right now, there were only 2 of them. Where the other 2 were, he didn't even know. The wolf did not back down, but it seemed only a matter of time before he would need to catch his breath. Suddenly the hyena stopped in mid-attack and ran back up the road. The wolf charged after her. Gray, no! Joshua thought, but the wolf was gone, disappearing between 2 houses. Joshua flew up into one of the higher buildings, then to another, and one and yet another. From there, he looked down into a courtyard, into which the hyena had first fled. He saw the wolf follow her. The moment Gray stepped into the courtyard, which was surrounded on 4 sides by stone walls with a small opening through which they had come in, Joshua knew it. It's a trap! He screamed in his thoughts. Get out of there! As Gray turned, the other 2 hyenas entered. One came toward the wolf, the other waited at the entrance, guarding it and making sure he would not be able to get out. Joshua didn't think twice about it. He swooped down and went straight for the one at the entrance. As the 2 other hyenas closed in on the wolf, who was now cornered in the opposite side of the entrance, Joshua landed on the head of the third. He went straight for her eyes. That was the only thing he could think to do. The hyena tried to snap at him, and the first couple of times Joshua was still able to hold on to her. But then she jerked her head to one side, and he lost his grip. He crashed to the ground and lay before her. For an instant, nothing happened. Suddenly, his courage turned into utter panic, and terror-stricken, he tried to get to his feet. The hyena turned her head toward him. Her blind eyes stared at him from above, and he thought he saw her grin. Then her jaws opened to grab him. In that instant, Gray rammed into her, pushing her to the ground. "Go!" he thought to Joshua, and with that he fled behind the next house. And as Joshua flew up, he saw that the three hyenas charged after the wolf. He followed their path from the air. They reached the road and crossed it. The wolf ran through the stream, which was surprisingly deep. It slowed him down enough for the hyenas to catch up. One of them went into the water with him. The others ran further down the road to a small footbridge to cut the wolf off on the other side. When Gray came out of the water, he went in the opposite direction along the creek. The hyena closest to him followed him out of the water and ran after him. But suddenly, something strange happened. When the hyena was just about to reach him, she fell to the ground. She got back up and ran a few more feet before she fell again. This time, she just lay there. Gray looked back and couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. The hyena made one more feeble attempt to get up, but then stopped moving altogether. She seemed to fall into herself until, after only a few more seconds, there was nothing left of her but her fur flattened to the ground. And even that seemed to disappear rapidly into the earth. The other two hyenas didn't seem to notice and charged after Gray as ferociously as before. Just when the wolf began to run into the space between two houses, it occurred to Joshua. "Water! It's the water, Gray! There's something in the water! You must lead them into the creek!" Joshua hoped that Gray could still hear him, as he had already disappeared between two houses. But suddenly the wolf came racing back out and straight toward the creek. The two hyenas followed him into it without hesitation. They did not know. It occurred to Joshua that they had no idea what would cause their demise. Gray jumped out of the water on the other side and ran straight toward Creek, who was still fighting the first hyena. Creek saw the wolf pursued by the other two, who suddenly lost their footings and fell, tumbling over several times before they stopped moving. Creek knew instantly what he needed to do and charged toward the creek. The last hyena was hard on his tail when he went into the water. Creek didn't bother coming back out. He just ran up the stream until the hyena stopped moving. Whatever was left of her body was washed away. The life that had temporarily been forced back into her was gently taken by the stream and so purified of all that was unnatural to her being. Death could finally claim her, and her tortured soul found peace at last. Far above them, unseen, unheard, and unnoticed, the vulture circled overhead, her blind eye peering down at them. Her hatred for the rooster intensified 1,000-fold, and she knew she would not rest until he lay before her on the ground, crumbling and begging for his life. She would take it from him, and in doing so, make hers last forever. They stood shaking, the terror still clinging to their exhausted bodies. It was only slowly overtaken by the relief that they had survived. Gray finally lay down in the middle of the road and began to lick his wounds. They were mostly superficial, but could get infected later on. Better to take care of them now. Joshua looked at Creek's new scars. The old ones haven't even healed yet, he thought, more to himself than to anyone else. They will heal, Joshua, as did all the others, the horse replied. Joshua found himself in awe of the warhorse and the wolf and of what they had endured, were still enduring. Is this what friends do? Stay with you until the end, with no question, no complaint, and with your safety the sole concern inside their thoughts and hearts. He did not believe it possible that friendship could reach such depth. He was humbled before it. He could not have conceived the riches this brought to him, and he could not think of anything he wanted more in his life than this. Even his dream of the 3 feathers seemed dull in comparison. He thought at that moment that as much as he still wished to find them, if he were to be without his friends, he would not want the feathers, not for any price. He would rather stay with Gray and Creek instead, wherever that might be. They decided to rest for a short while. Wary of what lay ahead, Creek insisted that they might need their strength and all of it before this was over. At first it seemed odd to Joshua that the horse did not want to charge forth and confront the vulture head-on. But then he realized that Creek, as much as he wanted to see Wind again, was frightened of the condition in which he would find her. It was an impossible situation for the horse, and Joshua wished he could do something about it. Sometimes avoiding one's worst nightmares, he thought, seemed as daunting a task as confronting them. During their brief rest, the wolf caught a few fish in the stream. Creek grazed on a patch of grass, and Joshua was able to still his hunger on what he found in the soft soil. As they walked out of the old mining town on the opposite side of where they had entered, Joshua considered that, under normal circumstances, the landscape here would probably be worth exploring. He wondered if the large pillars were cut by hand as part of the mining operation, or if they had been here, built up over eons and eons of time. He also wondered about the light source and its origin. How had the hyenas come back to life? And the spiders? He had yet to lay eyes on the vulture. Only in frantic images that he received from Creek had he seen her. Going toward what could easily be his own death was not something he looked forward to. It was a somber walk through the valley for the 3 companions as they passed a seemingly endless number of pillars that rose from the ground far up toward an invisible ceiling. The light source receded into the distance behind them, and as they continued to move ever deeper into the massive cave, Joshua suddenly realized that it had gotten significantly darker. When they eventually climbed a small hill and stood on its crest looking forward, it appeared as if the massive cave ahead swallowed the light completely. A relatively small distance away from them, the path they were walking on disappeared into utter darkness. "Gray, how far can you see into the cave?" Joshua asked. "Not very far at all," Gray answered. "I don't like this," Joshua added. The thought of not knowing where the next step would lead was frightening enough under normal circumstances, but they also had to think about the possibility of an ambush at any moment. Before Joshua could fully picture hundreds of glowing spiders' eyes in the dark before him, the wolf cut into his thoughts, reminding him once again not to go where he was about to go. "I will be right next to you," the wolf's thoughts reassured him. "And I will be on your other side," Creek added. "Then what are we waiting for?" he thought, looking up at them. The wolf smiled in his thoughts. Joshua took one hesitant step forward, and then another, and another after that. Gray and Creek followed, taking their places on either side of him as they descended from the hill and rejoined the path. To anyone watching, it would have seemed as if they simply disappeared into the darkness. Hi there. Chapter 20, Awakening. His sleep was deep, and in it he created worlds beyond worlds, and he went far into them, and he lost himself in them. For centuries he slept, weaving dreams that spun in all directions. They took him to places of deepest darkness and brightest sunlight. He felt the winds of the plains take him, and he flew high above the land and reached far beyond the stars. He sailed on solar winds through the emptiness of space. He watched whole civilizations come and go and rebuild themselves only to be destroyed again. He saw the summit of creation, and he felt the depth of despair along with the heights of peace among men. He was free, and the longer he slept, the further his dreams took him. And he saw places so ancient they had existed before time, and he glimpsed futures that had not yet been realized, but soon would come to life. Then he awoke. He became aware of his deepest core first. He felt his heart beat against his massive chest. It transported his blood through silver veins, blood that was of darkest blue. One drop of it could kill all forms of life within 100 yards. He began to feel the extension of his limbs, the cold in his extremities, the movement in his scales when air streamed into his lungs. He felt the heat of his breath as it scorned the air in front of him. When his eyes opened, his pupils adjusted to the light. Deep green irises contracted into small slivers. He saw everything at once. The beam of light that pierced the darkness from somewhere high above in the crystalline ceiling. The body of water to his left, its surface reflecting its surroundings in shimmering light. The blackened soil in front of him. He saw the claws in his powerful front talons that could cut into stone, that could carve pillars out of granite. He felt the power returning to his limbs and all the way to the tip of his leathered wings. But something was wrong. He could not name it until he heard it. It was just a whisper at first, then 2, then 5, then a dozen voices murmuring, sighing in an ever-returning rhythm. The whispers slowly turned into sounds, indistinguishable at first until they became small feet on charred ground, hairy limbs rushing against each other. The light, that was what was missing. It was too dark in here. The light source in the crystallite ceiling on one side of the cave was completely blocked. When his eyes looked up, he saw them, and before he could command his powerful legs to push him off and to burn them into oblivion with his fiery breath, they descended upon him. The spiders came, and while they overtook his steering body, they wove their web and covered him with it. He fought them. He pushed off with his hind legs, extended his wings far to either side. He lifted off, but only for an instant. From afar, it was an image of terrifying beauty. In the semi-darkness of the cave, the massive dragon fought for his life, fought to lift off the ground. But there were too many. The more that fell off of him, the more that jumped onto him from the ceiling. In the end, he lost the battle and was soon covered in a web that left him no choice but to watch what was about to happen. He saw the ivory coat of the Pegasus before he could see what she was. And when he did, when he saw the spiders carrying her while others built a web in the air between two pillars, and when they lifted her lifeless body up and fastened her to the web that spanned easily 100 yards across, and when he saw her beauty in the beam of light that gently rested upon her, he also saw the deep and dark red markings, the inflamed and festering cuts all over her body. When he saw it all, he wept for her. And where his tears fell to the ground, penetrating the charred soil, small flowers began to grow in the darkness underground. And if someone would have visited the abandoned cave only a few years later, she would have seen a sea of flowers covering the dragon's den and the area where he had slept. But now there was only death. The dragon, who could no longer distinguish between his dreams and the lives before he slept, thought he remembered the Pegasus as they fled deep into the mountain 1,000 years since past. They were freed in the mines by a small group of sky people who had no choice but to seal the caves forever. He knew then, in an instant, the whole of Wind's past, what she thought was her betrayal of her own race, and her subsequent choice to be petrified in stone until the mountain would take her or the elements would diminish her into oblivion. And he saw her gaining her freedom, born out of the sheer pain of the warhorse for her imprisonment. He saw the rooster and the wolf, and through her he saw their companionship with each other. And what he had dismissed many lifetimes ago in exchange for an existence in solitude began to stir deep within him, and thoughts of friendship and of the hope it brought came to him through her, and it lifted his heart high above, even though his body was bound to the stone. And he knew that she was alive, that the poison of the vulture had only slowed her heartbeat to a point of seeming death, but that she was still there, faint perhaps, and not for very much longer, but still alive. He held on to this thought, lying there tied with thousands of threads, held tight against the floor. He felt a surge of power coming through him. He thought that he would let it build up until he would no longer be able to contain it, and then he would free her and free himself, and his fury would know no limits. At that moment, the vulture landed in front of him, and when she looked into his eyes, he could not help but see his own death and the shattering of all the hopes he ever held inside. And even though he could feel the life of the Pegasus slowly leaking out of her, he could not muster the strength to oppose the vulture's glance that told him unmistakably of his demise. But that was not what he was afraid of. What he feared the most was just one thing. And when he allowed the thought of it to come into his mind, he knew it could not be undone. He knew the vulture saw it clearly within him. She would not kill him. She would leave him here in the darkness, alive. But she would take his dreams from him, and she would exchange them for nightmares that would last for an eternity.